Well, Michael, let's get to just one more question here, and this one's coming from the Colson, from one of our Colson fellows.
It is. I thought this was a great question in light of what we just talked about, especially. And he asks, I'm trying to determine how to spend my energy. It seems like you all think we as Christians need to leave the results of this presidency alone and focus on living out our values. Do I understand you correctly?
It is a great question, and I think the answer is no, because I don't think that's what we're saying at a fundamental level. Part of I think how this question is being asked seems to suggest that we got two options: either we care too much about politics, or we just leave it completely alone and live lives of personal morality. Both of those things are fundamentally wrong, because it's not accurate to put all of our hope in politics. On one hand, on the other hand, Christianity is not just a religion of private personal morality; it is a claim on all of reality. And Christians should do what good they can anywhere and everywhere as if Christ is king, because he is, right? But that's kind of what we're hearing right now. It's and especially from those who are chiding people who were too involved in politics, is basically saying, let's sit this one out now. We can't sit this one out. There's too many kids at stake right now in this presidency. There's too many families that are at stake. There's too much happening in the ideological colonization of other countries around the priorities and values of the sexual revolution. There is a call for us to be involved as citizens. Now, look, in many times past, Christians didn't have that sort of voice. They didn't have a say in their public policy, in their elected representatives, in what happened in laws and so on. America does have that. I always think about that scene, Michael, from The Patriot. I don't know if you remember at the very beginning of The Patriot when Mel Gibson's character is at the South Carolina legislature and they're trying to decide whether they're going to join the revolutionary cause or not. And Gibson is against it because he's against the war. And somebody says, why should a king 1,000 miles away make decisions for us? And he goes, should I trade a king 1,000 miles away for 1,000 kings 1 mile away? And it's a good question, and the answer is that's what we did. We traded that. You and I are kings in the system, at least according to the American. It may not always feel like that, but that's the sort of responsibility that we have. And I want to specifically deal with this part of the question. Should we focus on living out our values? No. Values are beliefs. Virtues are aligning our behavior with beliefs. We should live lives of virtue. Lives of virtue are lives that are consistent with what we believe to be true. And what we believe to be true is not just how we should be nice or how we even should be civil. What we believe to be true is that the world was created by God, that human nature is fallen and futile and frail, that the world needs redemption and reconciliation, and that God has restored his church, or God has raised up his church in order to do that kind of restoration work until he comes again and makes all things new. That's what we most deeply believe. Being nice, being civil, and all those other things get confused with Christian values all the time. That's just how we're supposed to do this other work we're supposed to do. It's not a successful Christian life to be nice. It's a successful Christian life to live out a Christian framework. And so, and that framework is this story of God in Christ that he has been writing since the very beginning, that we get to join and have ultimate hope in. So, look, we have said this for several months now, Michael, that one of the things that we have to do in a time where we're given these kind of false alternatives is learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. We've got to do both. We can care about politics and not put our hope in politics. We can care about the systems and structures that victimize people out of bad ideas and also love our neighbor individually on a personal level. We can have a personal walk with Christ and still respect the public nature of the claims of Christianity about the lordship of Christ. We can do both. We might have to relearn how to do both, but we can do both, and we have to do both.
Yeah. Well, I'm always struck by a question like that. So if you know emphasis on political participation is the objective, well, then what do you do when you're done? I mean, for me, my political participation is I stay informed, I participate in the election process, but beyond that, what do I do? Well, for me, I go on to the next thing, and I keep doing the next thing, and I keep doing the next thing, and I'm following my conscience, and I'm trying to live. I love how you distinguish between virtues and values. I think another way of thinking of that is these virtues are something that exists outside and above us.
Hmm.
They're things to which we aspire, whereas values are simply opinions and personal preferences. Um, Virtues are transcendent. They come from God. These are things we aspire to achieve and live our lives in accordance with. But we live that out in a multitude of small and daily ways, and I think this is again gets back to Schaeffer's view of the bits and pieces,
Hmm.
but understanding how we need to participate faithfully in the bits and pieces, but do so in light of the whole, the bigger story, the larger story, the redemptive story,
Yeah.
of which we're all a part.
Let me give another quick mental model here too, and that is maybe this was helpful. This is what helped me the most in trying to figure this out. Is that we often when we put too much eggs kind of in the political basket, is that we think about our lives and life together as kind of a top-down enterprise. So let's win the next election. So then from the top down, we can impose a way of life that we think is the right way. Um, and then there's kind of the let's stay away from politics, which is the individualism, right? Let's just live lives focused on living out our values, be nice to everyone, and so on. But in between the individual and the state, there's all this territory. Uh, Between DC and the individual are a bunch of neighborhoods, a bunch of organizations, and a bunch of life that's lived in commerce and worship and volunteering and community. And what's happened over the last several decades is that we have spent so much energy yelling at DC and yelling at Hollywood. Sometimes we can control those outcomes, sometimes we can't control. We at least have limited control. But we've done that at the expense of caring about what's happening in our own backyards, in our own communities, and our own neighbors. It is a political act to build a strong family. You know why? Because if you build a strong family, then you have now an institution for cultivating good citizens. Now, I'm not even talking in Christian language. I'm talking about in pure political language now. If you cultivate good citizens, now you don't need a bigger police force. You need a smaller police force. Now, we can see that take place in history when the family is strong, when local, when activity of individuals is focused not just on their personal lives, but loving neighbor as well. And it's what's called having a strong middle in society, where the mediating structures, which are kind of code names for those institutions and structures that provide a buffer between the freedom of the individual citizen and the force of the state. When those things are robust and strong, then the government doesn't need to step in. Now, we all know the government's eager to step in anywhere and everywhere that it possibly can, and it's really hard to get them to step back out once they step in. So the goal is to have this robust middle that can push out the controlling forces of the state and let the state do what the state's good at. The state's not good at local stuff. So that is a political statement, and without even kind of addressing the fact that, oh, hey, that really aligns with the Christian calling in our lives to love God and to love our neighbors, and to love our neighbors in terms of families and care about issues like outside of personal morality as a way of loving our neighbor. That aligns perfectly with that, and it is an act of political strength that doesn't force you to make this choice between kind of doing the dirty work of electioneering, so to speak, and then just being a personal private citizen who is nice to people. In between those two things is a million options, but we have
Yeah.
forgotten that there are that many options.
Well, and always being mindful, do institutions create people, create and form people, or do people create and form institutions?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little bit of both. But if I'm going to hedge my bets, I'm going to bet on the organism. I'm going to bet on the creation. that will influence institutions and move them toward the better. And that's where we ought to spend our time, is on people.